Don't show me a telescope. Well, I'm going to show you a telescope. That's what all this preamble is about. My approach to that, and a lot of us discuss this a lot, there's a growing movement now of heterodox economics. And the dilemma is this: how do you confront this? Well, the traditional way that economists confronted, the traditional way that left-wing economists confronted right-wing economists, was to say, what we want you to do is carry on acting like a religion, but adopt our religion instead of yours. Adopt the Keynesian religion instead of the Friedmanian. That's the traditional manner of reacting. And I think what's necessary is a break with that whole manner of thinking. A break with the whole manner that all you need to do is to replace one orthodoxy with another. For those of you who have any familiarity with the history of the Catholic Church, I call this the strategy of the Pope in Avignon. There was a great schism in the Catholic Church in the 12th century, and for a while there were two popes, one in Avignon and one in Milan. And then actually there was a movement of unity which led to the third pope, who was the unity pope. And then they all just gave up and modern times arrived, and then capitalism started. So that was the end of that. But anyway, you can't have a pope in Avignon. What you need is something close to Protestantism, which I'm sure you'll all be happy with in Norway, but not state Protestantism. We need the original idea of Luther, which is people have to learn to read the Bible themselves. So people have to learn to do economics themselves.
But they still read the Bible.
They can read the Bible.
So IMF does the small change, and you mean there is a need for a bigger change? And not another book.
Not another book.
Not another book.
As long as one accepts that, well, I'm reasoning in a rather analogous way. I don't mean people should write theory themselves. I mean people should look at the evidence for themselves. The most important test for any theory is it has to submit to the test of evidence. And what I'm saying is it's within the grasp of any person who is reasonably not frightened of numbers, which is about 50% of the population. One does have to use a spreadsheet and add up. But that's it. You don't have to be able to solve differential equations, although Lagrangian optimization will solve equations that look like that, or even equations that look like that. You don't have. All you have to be able to do is add up. This is what I'm saying. Can look at evidence and submit the theories to the test of that evidence. And what I want to submit to you is there's two things you need to do in order to construct a body of evidence which is good enough to provide the equivalent of Galileo's telescope. And the whole point about Galileo's telescope is he didn't just look at one star, he looked at the heavens. He looked at all the objects in the heavens and said, I want a theory that explains everything I see, not just one thing I see. We had a discussion yesterday with the Norwegian Ministry of Development, and one of the things that was said against what I'm about to say is, well, what you say is not true in the case of Malaysia. And I said, yeah, but there are 20 million people in Malaysia and there are 6 billion people in the world. What's the good of a theory that only works for Malaysia? One needs a theory that works for the whole world. So, the Galileo, you observe the whole heavens. That means two things. First of all, you have to look at all countries and not just some countries. This idea, you take a shining example and say this proves the theory. I don't accept that. I think that's wrong. Because you can always have exceptions to any rule, particularly in the sphere of economics. And the smaller the country, the easier it is to get an exception. The second thing is you must take a long period of time. Somebody was saying to me just now, well, surely, and this is true, the neoliberal argument was, well, 20 years of rather bad consequences of globalization are necessary because now things are going okay. For the last 3 years, Brazil has been growing at 7%. India has been growing at 8%, and that's wonderful. To which my response was, yes, but Brazil has grown at the rate of 8% 4 times in the last 30 years. The problem is, when it had finished growing at the rate of 8%, it shrank at the rate of 20%. It goes like that. I mean, one of the most notorious problems of Latin American economies are that they're what they call volatile. They go up and down. Therefore, in order to see what's really happening in the historical process, one needs to take a period of time long enough that you account for the effects of these random fluctuations. You don't make a random, well, not a random fluctuation, but a short-term fluctuation the proof of a long-term historical phenomenon. Okay, now, very long preamble, but the good news is this: it's possible to do this now, because the World Bank has done one great service to the world, and that's the IMF, which is produce data. It's now possible, without paying a lot of money, to get data that goes back to 1960 for nearly every country in the world on many fundamental economic indicators. And with the IMF, it's even better, because you can get data that goes forward to 2020. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that the IMF is telepathic. They issue forecasts. The forecasts, the closer you get to the present day, the more you can treat these forecasts as a sort of reasonable estimate. Okay. So you can basically get 45 years of data, 1960 up to 2005, for, at the beginning of that period, 80% of the world's population, and by the time you get to 1980, you have 98% of the world's population included. And you can start to look at what is happening to the world economy. What is the number of people in the world? What is the amount of money in terms of what's called GDP or output that those people are making? And what are the trends in the world economy? So I took that data, I added that data up, and I divided it into two great parts. One part is those people that the IMF calls advanced. Why did I do that? Because we're dealing with an exercise in the demystification of a religion, and I don't accept the word advanced. The reason I don't accept that is that it implies that everybody else is backward, which has a kind of racist undertone to it. It implies that the problem with the countries that are not growing as fast as the ones that are called advanced is that their people are stupid, or that historical institutions have not caught up. I don't accept that word, but I'm pointing out I'm making the division because the IMF makes that division, advanced and non-advanced. However, once one starts doing the empirical work, you find that the word that the IMF uses for advanced and non-advanced, covers the same group of population in the world that is described in a different way by the anti-globalization movement. So the countries they call advanced are the countries that the anti-globalization movement calls the North. The countries they call non-advanced are the South. Sometimes they're called the rich and the poor countries. Anybody who's familiar with the works of Lenin will know that he used to call them the imperialist countries and the colonial and semi-colonial countries. Those who are familiar with the development literature of the 70s, they used to be called the dependent and the dominant economies, or the core and the periphery. It doesn't matter what word you use, the object is the same. There is one group of countries which in 2002 contained 970 million people, and essentially for 150 years the geographical extent of that area has been constant. That was the first empirical finding. Remarkably few countries have crossed from poor to rich. In fact, they are Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, and Korea. Possibly now one, depending on how one would categorise it before, might include Ireland, Greece, and Portugal. And it's possible that we may see, because of integration into Europe, some kind of switch of the position of the accession countries of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and so on. That's possible. If all those countries, taking the optimistic view, and there is one country which in the history of the United Nations has been officially certified as a developed country. So the United Nations have developed policies of development to work for one country, Cyprus. Cyprus is the only country ever declared to be officially developed by the United Nations. If you add up the population of all those, there are about 120 million people. So the actual geographical extent of the North, advanced, rich, call it what you will, has grown by 25%. Almost unchanged, and the geographical extent of the poor countries has diminished by 1% of its population. So it's a remarkably geographically stable division of the world. In a certain sense, that to me is a big fact, because it tells you any policy for development which says what we're going to do is promote somebody out of the group of poor countries into the group of rich countries, that policy is not going to work. It hasn't worked for